Hello and welcome to This World. My name is Virkram, Chandra, and you're watching WION World is One. This week's top story is one of devastation, desperation, and helplessness in the face of a disaster. I am, of course, talking about the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. Earthquakes that have put millions of futures at stake, left thousands homeless. More than 22,000 people have died. Can you prepare for an earthquake of this magnitude? Could Turkey have responded better? Were the earthquakes the final nails in the coffin for war-torn Syria? We will try and answer all of these questions and a lot more on the show tonight. We're also going to be bringing you the latest in the Adani saga. What is the road ahead for the Indian billionaire and his business empire? And what are the lessons from this episode? One that very few people saw coming, but which may have broader implications for India. Also on this program, we're going to be taking a look at the chatbot wars. We've been hearing so much about chat GPT, and that's taken the world by storm. And then Google came out with its own counterpart. Didn't have the best of early demos, but that is a story we're going to take a look at. But before we do any of that, let's take a quick look at all those stories that have been making headlines this week around the world. First of all, Pakistan, which continues to teeter towards bankruptcy. Those talks with the IMF don't seem to have gone very well. There still seems to be some sort of a standoff and a stalemate, so the IMF delegation has flown back. Pakistan's foreign reserves fallen to below $3 billion, and it is now really becoming an almost existential crisis. Keep an eye on this space to see what is going to happen out there. Moving on, a United Nations report claims that ISS Khorasan have threatened to launch attacks against the embassies of India, Iran and China in Afghanistan to undermine the relationship between the Taliban and the UN member states in the Central and South Asian regions. Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the European Parliament in person following a short visit to the United Kingdom and France. Zelensky called on European Union leaders to provide fighter jets and arms to Kiev. The American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has reported that the Nord Stream pipeline was bombed by America's Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, in a covert operation at the direction of the White House. Now, President Joe Biden's administration has denied the allegations, calling the report utterly false and complete fiction. Iran has revealed a large underground air force called Eagle 44 with the state-controlled news agency IRNA, claiming that the base is used for hosting fighter jets armed with long-range cruise missiles. India has discovered its first big lithium reserves in the country following the discovery of a 5.9 million ton deposit in Jammu and Kashmir. So far, India has depended on Australia and Argentina for its lithium imports. Lithium, of course, essential when it comes to electric vehicles and for batteries. This is what parts of Turkey looks like today. Syria looks no better. The two countries were hit by multiple earthquakes on Monday. The first one struck when people were sleeping around 4 a.m. in the morning. It was an earthquake measuring 7.8 on the Richter scale. Here is what happened next.
A father holding on to the hand of his dead teenage daughter. A sister shielding her little brother from the rubble they are buried under. A newborn girl child is found with her umbilical cord still attached to the mother, who is now dead. These are some of the stories of Monday's earthquake. These are stories of the people whose fates were sealed at 4:17 local time on the 6th of February, when buildings in Turkey and Syria began falling like a pack of cards. A 7.8 magnitude quake hit the two countries. This was the epicenter, near the city of Gaziantep, which is home to 2 million people. Strong tremors were also felt in Lebanon, Cyprus and Iraq. Initial reports said that some 70 people had died in Gaziantep. Soon that toll began climbing. A series of aftershocks began hitting Turkey and Syria. The first one was a 6.7 magnitude quake. It hit at 4:28 a.m. local time. With the daybreak, reports emerged of at least 140 buildings having collapsed in the Turkish province of Malatya. At 9 a.m., the death toll had risen to 200. One hoped that the number would stop there. Little did anyone have an idea of what was in store. By 11 a.m., Syria said some 300 people had died in the war-torn country. With the blink of an eye, the death toll in both Syria and Turkey crossed 500. A race against time had begun. The goal was to rescue those buried under the buildings. But how many buildings had collapsed in total? No one could tell. Anything between 1,000 to 3,000 was the wild guess. On the streets of Turkey, you could hear cries. See people looking for their loved ones, trying to dig the rubble with bare hands. Help did arrive eventually, but in many cases, it was too late.
My mother was alive, but then she died.
Horror stories began pouring in from Syria too.
The building collapsed on us. We were 16 and 13 of us died. My brother, 1.5-year-old niece and I got out. Thank God.
Soon, things went from bad to worse. At 1:24 p.m., another earthquake hit Turkey. This one was 7.5 on the Richter scale. The world woke up to the news of the tragedy in West Asia. Countries promised help. India sent search and rescue teams with dog squads. New Delhi also sent medicines and medical equipment. As we speak, specialists are working round the clock to attend to the injured. Also, rescue those who are still trapped under the rubble. This is Noor. She was pulled out of the rubble 2 days after the earthquakes. In Turkey, many are now sleeping in makeshift tents. There are also those who have nowhere to go, no roof over their head.
Our home is gone. We got caught in the rain. We sleep in wet ground. We don't even have a hot tea to drink. Look at our situation. May God help us.
What happened on Monday was Turkey's deadliest earthquake since 1999. 13.5 million people have been affected in Turkey alone. In war-torn Syria, the situation is no better. Over 22,000 people have been killed in both countries. Mass burial sites are now being dug in Syria. New cremation homes are being set up in Turkey too. This cat's name is Strawberry. It was pulled out from the rubble in Hatay on Thursday. This is Pamuk. He was buried under the rubble for 3 days. This newborn baby too was recently rescued. The Syrian boy smiled and began playing with rescue workers when he was pulled out. These are some stories of hope in the middle of tragedy. But as days pass and the week progresses, that hope is slowly fading.
This clearly is as devastating as it gets. But whom do you hold responsible for this? Well, first of all, nature. Turkey happens to sit in a ring of fire. In other words, it is prone to earthquakes, often deadly earthquakes. Let's just look at some of the recent quakes that have actually hit Turkey. In November 1999, a 7.2 earthquake hit the Turkish towns of Dutske. Nearly 850 people died. In May 2003, a 6.4 magnitude quake hit Bengal. A school dormitory collapsed. 167 people died. 87 of them were children. In March 2020, a 6.1 magnitude quake hit Elazig. 42 people died. In October 2011, there were 2 earthquakes. 644 people died. Strong tremors were also felt in January 2020 and October 2020. So Turkey is no stranger to quakes. Nothing being quite this damaging for a long period of time. But Turkey is no stranger for quakes, much like Japan, which also happens to sit on a ring of fire. In Japan's case, it sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. One of the differences, though, Japan also has the world's best earthquake-resistant construction. And that's a lesson for all of us to learn. What does Turkey have? Now, currently, it has multiple towns that have been flattened by the quake. The Turkish President Erdogan had said, you can't prepare for a disaster of this scale. And he's right. You can't predict that an earthquake this big can actually happen. But you can plan for it to some extent when it comes to the quality of construction, and you can learn how to respond to it better. Erdogan has been accused of letting down his voters, of not responding appropriately to the quake. The president admits his shortcomings. There are those, however, who believe that the earthquake's devastation has also exposed corruption in the Erdogan regime and in local administration. How? They say that while one can't expect buildings on the fault line directly to resist a 8 magnitude or a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, the fact is that more than 5,000 buildings have fallen down across Turkey. And that points at a rot that may run much, much deeper. It points to possible errors in construction. Maybe buildings were sanctioned which were not earthquake resistant to the level that they should have been. Now let's remember, after the 2011 earthquake, way back then, Erdogan, who was then the Prime Minister of Turkey, had blamed shoddy construction for the high death toll. He had said, and I quote, municipalities, constructors and supervisors should now see that their negligence amounts to murder. Now, exactly that same yardstick should apply right now. Apply to the Erdogan government, apply to municipalities, and apply to anybody who may have allowed corners to be cut, and that led to this sort of a death toll, 22,000 people dead, and all those buildings falling down. Now, in neighboring Syria, of course, it's a slightly different situation, because frankly, there's hardly anyone to actually hold accountable out there. Syria has been in the middle of a civil war, in the middle of a crisis for year after year after year. If you look at the map, this is the area that was the worst affected by the quake, the northwestern part of the country. More than 4 million people live out here, and a large number of them are already relying on humanitarian assistance, even before the earthquake struck. The international community has been trying to deal with how do we help the people in Syria. But the communities living out here were already battling a cholera outbreak. For the rest of the world, there are also some big, scary questions that have been raised by what happened. Was Monday a pre-cap of something deadly that could affect many of us? For example, could there be other earthquakes? Could parts of the world be hit by an even stronger quake? And are we prepared for that? And that's also a question, for example, that people in India are thinking about. How do you prepare for this? Are we ready for it? There have been lots and lots of small earthquakes in northern India for a long period of time. Just go through some of the headlines. You almost don't notice it right now. Tremor hits Delhi, tremor hits the National Capital Region, tremor hits the Himalayas, small earthquake in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, Jammu and Kashmir shaken by a quake. This has become so common, we almost don't pay too much attention to it. But we should, because these are small quakes. And if a big quake comes, if an earthquake or 7.5 on the Richter scale was to suddenly hit, are we ready? Are we prepared? Are the buildings ready? Can they take a shock like that? And if, God forbid, an earthquake like that does strike, are our responses going to be fine? Yes, lots of systems have been set up here in India, but they could be tested, and therefore we need to be completely prepared. And now to get us up to date with what's actually happening on the ground, I'm being joined by journalist Lara Villanon, who's been monitoring the situation there. Lara, thank you so much for joining us. What is the latest you can tell us on what must be scenes of devastation that you can see around you?
Yes, so we are in the city of Izmir, in one of the main centers that are gathering since many days humanitarian aid to send to the affected areas after this terrible earthquake of 7.8 that happened last Monday in the southeast of Turkey. We have to remember that Turkey has a lot of internal migration, so in every city of the country, in every point of the country, everybody knows or has family members in the affected areas of the earthquake. So that's why everyone feels very empathetic. Everyone is been suffering after this earthquake and has been doing whatever they can. Some people gathered cars and trucks to send to the area to help people. Others, even miners, went to take out rubble to help the rescue teams to be able to find alive people under the rubbles. And some others, like we are here, are gathering resources to help all these people that for sure for many weeks will suffer the effects of this terrible earthquake. After talking to some of them, they told us that they've been, since Monday, they construct this kind of tent, these two tents, where they catalog and distribute this humanitarian aid. They said that mainly they are gathering blankets, a lot of food and water that they can consume in an easy way in the streets, and also generators and heaters, because let's remember that this terrible earthquake, it happened in the middle of winter in an area that has been suffering snow storms, but also like temperatures below zero.
Lara, a lot of people do want to send help. What would you say to them? What do you think is actually required there right now in Turkey or Syria for that matter? What can people send that would be the most helpful?
Yes, so how can we help? How can we help the area? How can we help southeast of Turkey and north of Syria? So India, for example, has sent 200 rescue teams to the area, but as a citizens, we wonder, of course, when we see these terrible images, how can we help? So online, there are many NGOs that are on the field, and they told us that there is a huge need, not only generators, but also blankets, water, basic needs, baby pads, woman pads, and also there is a need of machines, because a lot of rescue teams, thousands of local and international rescue teams have been deployed in the area, but they told us that they need machines to take out the rubble from the area. Especially not only in the southeast of Turkey, as we said before, but in the north of Syria, there is even more need of humanitarian aid, because the country is isolated from the international colleagues. Like the international aid has taken many days to arrive, so they're in this fight to find people under the rubbles alive. They have less means, they have less tools to do it. So, of course, Turkey is in need of this help, but Syria even more.
All right, Lara, thank you so much for joining us with that update. And to discuss this and a lot more, especially how the world should prepare and respond to potential massive earthquakes in the future, I do have with me Professor Carlo Docleoni. Professor Docleoni, thank you so much for joining us. Now, why was this such a bad earthquake? Is it usual, is it common that you can have twin earthquakes that are more than 7.5 in the Richter scale? Is that the reason why there's been so much devastation?
Well, this is not so common, but is quite known in the literature, in the history of seismicity. We had a similar double event in 1999 near Istanbul in the Izmit earthquake, which made, unfortunately, 17,000 deaths. So that's something that occurs quite frequently, to have twin quakes.
Okay, President Adani, I'm sure the people in Turkey and in Syria are really concerned about further quakes, so there's a whole series of them. Is it possible? What, for example, can you tell us about that entire Anatolia fault line? Is it something that you still think could be prone to other major shocks and other big earthquakes in the weeks, months and years ahead?
Well, the southeast Anatolian fault is part of the boundary of a large crustal volume that separates the Anatolia plate with respect to the Arabia plate. So it is not just a single fault plane. It's a large, let's say 200-300 kilometers wide area of crustal thickening, where the two plates, Anatolia and Arabia, move relative to each other. So during the motion or the steady state motion of the two plates, this area is locked. So it's accumulating a lot of energy, elastic energy, which is released suddenly in just a few minutes maximum, and releasing something that was accumulated during, let's say, a few centuries. So it's an area where several faults allowed this movement and generated the seismic sequence that we are living.
Now, Professor Dakloni, I have to say, here in India, we've almost got used to multiple small quakes that are happening every year, especially in North India. They're not very big, but the earth shakes and it makes the headlines. Now, is this something that we should be worrying about, that why are these earthquakes happening? Or, as some experts seem to believe, is it actually good because the stress along the Himalayan fault line gets relieved by lots of small quakes, which means that a monster quake is somewhat less likely? What's your expert view on that?
No, unfortunately, it's not possible to say that, because we know that seismicity follows the rule of the Gutenberg-Richter distribution, which describes the frequency versus magnitude of the seismicity. The Himalaya belt is clearly associated to the convergence between Eurasia and the Indian plate, and most of the energy is released in the area of lower topography in the southern limb of the Himalayas. And the convergence of at least 3 to 3.6 centimeters per year between Eurasia and India generates a diffuse seismicity, but in the same time it accumulates energy also for bigger earthquakes like the Kathmandu earthquake in 2015.
Okay, Professor Dakloni, for people watching this, what precautions do you think authorities should take to make people and buildings safer?
Well, it depends what it kills are the houses. And so it means that we have to have houses built in an anti-seismic project. So the important thing is to evaluate the big ground acceleration that may occur in a given area, because in central India it's very different from the foothills of the Himalaya. The seismicity there is much higher. And in the epicentral areas, we may infer the accelerations of the soil, of the ground, so the engineers can build the houses accordingly. So the mission of geophysicists is not only to study earthquakes and to understand more and more what can be done for the safety of people, but also to give the numbers of the shaking that occurs during an earthquake in order to have houses more and more safety.
Well, Professor Dagluni, thank you so much for joining us. And I have to say, our thoughts and our prayers are for everyone there in Turkey and in Syria. If, by the way, you're in either of those countries, you have any request for assistance or there's any help you can offer from anywhere else, do tweet to us, use the hashtag #ThisWorld, and we'll try and amplify your message to our viewers in 190 countries to try and see how we can possibly help. Well, let's talk about now about the Adani saga, tremors in a business sense that have actually been hitting that group. I know we've spoken about it last week as well, but as you can see, this particular story refuses to die down. And it's not hard to tell why. We're talking about one of the world's richest people and one of the biggest conglomerates in India being accused of what Hindenburg research called stock manipulation and fraud and improper use of offshore havens. Now, last week we told you that the company taking on Adani is a New York-based research firm. Its name is Hindenburg Research. We also told you that the Adani Group and its chief, Gautam Adani, have strongly denied Hindenburg's allegation. But all of this has not been enough to stop a domino effect of other press reports, other ramifications, all sorts of questions being asked, a political crisis. Last week I told you that the Adani Group has slipped from number 2 to number 13 on the Bloomberg billionaires list. Well, the selling has actually continued, though there was a bounce back in the middle. Currently he's at around 21, having lost more than $60 billion since the start of this year. Now, in case you're thinking that this is a story that concerns only India, you really might need to think again, because billionaire Gautam Adani, of course, has businesses around the world, be it in construction or defense. There are also businesses that have stakes in the Adani Group, including many who have invested in it. And some of the news that is coming from there is actually affecting stock market gyrations, especially in India. Earlier this week, Norway's sovereign fund sold all of its stakes in the Adani Group. Norway's wealth fund, worth some $1.35 trillion by the end of 2022. It did hold shares in 3 Adani companies. It had shares in Adani Green Energy that were worth some 52 million. A stake in Adani Total Gas was worth something like 83 million. And in Adani Ports and SEZ, the Norway sovereign fund held shares worth something like 63.4 million. On the 9th of February, the fund said it had divested all of those shares. Now, all of that is happening at a global level, and as I did say, there's been a lot of press attention, lots of reports coming out in publication after publication, whether it's Forbes or Wall Street Journal or The Economist. Back in India, the spotlight this week did move a little bit from Gautam Adani to Prime Minister Modi and the events in Parliament. It is said that the two of them are close, and that is something that the opposition tried to make it a point to remind Parliament about. That's the issue that they raised repeatedly in Parliament. The opposition essentially accused the Prime Minister of favoritism, of crony capitalism, of bending the rules for Adani. The opposition also called for a JPC, or a Joint Parliamentary Committee, to investigate the charges that are being levelled against Adani. Now, the Prime Minister gave a fiery reply in response to all of that, although he didn't directly name Adani or talk directly about the saga. He spoke a lot about what the opposition had done during its tenure. Now, events in Parliament aside, a lot of attention has really been focused on the volatility at the stock markets. For a couple of days on Tuesday and Wednesday, it looked as if the Adani Group was bouncing back. Adani Enterprises, for example, nearly doubled from its lows to go back about the 2,000 mark. And then, as reports came about other things happening, MSCI reducing Adani's weightage in indices, and other reports came out, and that led to some renewed selling on Thursday and Friday, which were again bad days at the market. There is a certain amount of difference, though. Some companies like Adani Total Gas are just falling and falling. Others are bouncing up and down. Some of them are looking relatively solid. These gyrations, by the way, could continue, and they could continue for a while. It is very unlikely that we have seen the last of this drama. And as I said, this is also going to be driven by news flow. It's not just media houses in India or Hindenburg Research. Now, a number of international publications have stepped inside and are continuing to come out with reports about Adani, about the Adani Group, about India, about the India story, and so on and so forth. So what actually lies ahead? Joining me to discuss this and a lot more is John Hyatt. He's the senior wealth reporter at Forbes, a publication that has done some of those reports. Welcome to the show, John. Thanks so much for joining us. I think the first thing which is obvious in all of this, yes, there's a lot of politics going on and there's this entire question of what's going to happen to the group and what the future is. But I think the immediate question is what's actually happening in the stock markets. You know, the extraordinary gyrations that we have seen for such a large group. Tens of billions of dollars in valuation up and down virtually every day.
Yeah, I mean, you know what it reminds me of is we've seen these quote unquote meme stocks in the US, companies like GameStop, Bed Bath & Beyond, even Tesla, whose share prices have gyrated violently amid waxing and waning investor interest. And so with what we've seen with Adani listed companies, it kind of reminds me of that. Obviously, the circumstances are different, but just the sheer double-digit percentage movements from day to day, I think absolutely reflects the investor uncertainty in the market right now around Adani Group companies.
Suraj, from a stock market point of view, I think by Wednesday, a lot of people were saying perhaps the worst is over for the Adani Group. They're all bouncing back. Stocks are jumping back. The worst is over. But now, again on Thursday and Friday, the selling restarted. Some of the group companies actually are looking buoyant. They're not seeing that much selling. Other group companies are falling much more. So do you think it's going to be a while before final price discovery plays itself out so we know where these companies are going to stand from a stock market price point of view?
I think it will depend on what the news flow is. I mean, we saw Thursday with the MSCI news that, MSCI, the big index tracker, is, looking at potentially delisting Adani Group companies. That, of course, has enormous impact on capital flows into companies like the Adani Group firms. So I think it will depend on the news flow. And I think it will depend as well on, the political situation in India. Whether or not there are sort of investigations or, actions that are initiated against Adani Group companies. I think also it will depend on kind of the situation in the US and Europe and elsewhere where, there are big financial institutions, banks, index investors like Vanguard and BlackRock. Like, how are these large financial institutions digesting the news? Will they continue to do business with or hold stock in Adani Group companies? And, capital markets are so much about momentum. So, if momentum shifts one way, we might see other companies, follow suit.
So, John, we did see some of the measures being taken by the Adani Group. First of all, there were some decent results announced by some of the group companies. Others, the results weren't that great. Some had good results, some didn't. And secondly, the fact that the Adani Group said, okay, we are prepaying part of the loans right now. Now, of course, there was a debate about the circumstances in which it was being repaid, but the fact that they were able to prepay a lot of loans, did that add to confidence? Did that make people feel that, all right, this is not a group that's actually going to default or go bust anytime soon?
I think that absolutely was a boost of confidence. And I think it was a reminder as well that these are not speculative tech companies whose revenues are, in their nascent phase. I mean, these are large industrial, real assets businesses with real cash flow. And that's extremely important when it comes to staving off criticism about over leverage, about alleged accounting irregularities. The Adani Group is a massive conglomerate with cash. And I think the ability to, pay off debt will definitely give a jolt of confidence to investors. But there is also, one concern that Hindenburg alleged is that there is hidden leverage within the Adani Group enterprise. So I think even if we see Adani Group companies pay off debt, there is still some concern about other leverage within the empire.
So, and I think that's a good point that you make, that you got to sort of look at the valuation, you got to look at the sort of businesses. There are some good businesses in the Adani Group which have real assets on the ground. But I think one of the questions that has been circling for the last 10-15 days, it is also there in the Hindenburg report, is the question of valuations, I guess. And I think one of the problems in that, John, is going to be that people are going to be asking, what is the correct way to value some of these companies? For example, green energy. How do you value that? Anywhere in the world, how do you value a company like that? How do you value green hydrogen, for example? These are businesses. Some of these are businesses that are notoriously different to value. What sort of price earnings multiple should you give to them?
Absolutely. And this is part of the flow of just capital markets and how company valuations work, of course. I mean, we see in all stock markets around the world, certain companies become, the hot stock to own, and we see, companies going to the moon. I think a big question with regard to, the valuation of Adani Group companies pertains to, the free float. These are massive companies by market cap, but a lot of that stock is owned by Adani himself or Adani Group affiliates. And this is at the heart of the Hindenburg allegations, is how much of the free float stock is actually being traded by the public and how much is owned by offshore entities in Mauritius or elsewhere that have close ties to Gautam Adani or Vinod Adani, his brother, or other potential related parties. So I think that's going to be a key sticking point going forward in this situation.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for that. Now, setting the markets aside and setting the Adani Group itself aside, the biggest issue that seems to be dominating attention around the world is the impact of this entire saga on the India story itself. And let's remember, the India story has actually been looking really good in the recent past. It's been shining, it's been bright. Everyone's been talking about the great future that the India story could have in the next 4 or 5 years. And now suddenly there are all these scary headlines about, oh, look at the India story and is it going to affect it? Now, is there any reason for the rest of the world to be concerned? Could the Adani saga really have an impact on the India story? Or is this something that is pretty much tied to one single group in India, big conglomerate, but one single group, and it is not something which will be extrapolated to the rest of the country? To decode some of this, I'm now being joined by Bhaskar Chakravarti, who is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and one of the real experts in this field. Welcome to the show, Professor Chakrabarti. Thank you so much for joining us. As you take a look at all that's been happening for the last 10, 15 days, this entire drama around the Adani Group and the big headlines from the rest of the world, what is your overall sense of what is happening?
Well, obviously, there are a large number of allegations that are in the Hindenburg report. And the Adani Group has denied them all. And in its rebuttals, it has mostly come back with not terribly substantial arguments for the denial. So everybody's waiting for something more substantive to come from the Adani Group. So as this back and forth goes on, certainly the financial markets are watching this very closely. There is a deep concern about the exposure that the Indian economy has more broadly, various enterprises in India has to the Adani Group's fortunes, certainly big state-owned enterprises, life insurance corporations, State Bank of India, and the core of the Indian growth story itself is exposed. So with all that being said, there is a larger connection to the current administration, and in many ways, the rise of the Modi administration has coincided with the rise of Adani. So both internally and outside, this is being seen as a bit of a litmus test for how real the India narrative is, both from a political standpoint and an economic standpoint, and for India's aspirations as a global power.
Okay, President Chakrabarti, let me just get into some of the points that you made now. Of course, there are some allegations that have been made in the Hindenburg research and elsewhere, and I guess at the end of the day, it is the authorities that will have to be look into that. The regulators will have to look into that, how these issues were actually done or played out. And that's something which I guess nobody can really decide in a studio as to whether it's right or wrong. The authorities will have to take a call on that. The other aspect is the impact of this on the general Indian markets and the exposure that others have to it, including in India or abroad. Now, some would say that perhaps that's been answered to some extent by the Reserve Bank of India and others to say, hey, look, the exposure is actually not that much. How would you respond to that? The clarifications that we've now heard from banks, from the LIC, and from the Reserve Bank of India. Do you take them at face value?
Well, I think we are watching this story unfold almost on a daily basis, and every time there's some reassuring news that comes out, there is a counter narrative that appears, which makes one kind of say, well, I'm not ready to declare victory as yet for either side, really. So just recently, we heard that MSCI is reviewing the free float status of the Adani Group, and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has decided to withdraw. So this is an unfolding story, and so I'm not sure we have reached any steady state to be able to declare anything as yet. And there are lots of questions about just the fundamentals, and what more is going to start coming out as more organizations both within India and outside start digging in.
All right, Professor Chakrabarti, but just digging in a little further into that, I guess the question that I have to ask is, all of this does connect with the India growth story. So the big question is the extent to which you should necessarily conclude that whatever is happening with the Adani Group and whatever is happening around that, does it have a bearing? And if so, how does it have a bearing with the larger India story? Because to play devil's advocate, there are some who would argue that, okay, maybe one of the largest Indian groups out there, and they are present in a lot of very important areas for the Indian economy. And there's this entire question of links with, how the government is going to respond to this. But issues around one group do not necessarily mean that the Indian economy is not going to do well, or that the India growth story is being derailed.
Well, I think the Adani Group is not just the tip of the iceberg; it is a significant, part of the iceberg, right? So, and for a lot of enterprises, political, economic, business, and others who are, very keenly interested in India and participating in the India growth story and watching it, from the outside and potentially assisting it as well. India happens to be a bit of an opaque market. And so every time something like this happens, the natural question is, how far does this issue lie? Is it just the Adani Group, or are there other major parts of Indian business that have similar questions attached to it? So it starts unraveling, many aspects of the narrative that people are hoping are going to hold together.
So, Professor Chakrabarti, if I understand you correct, that's one of the important lessons you think that the Indian government and the messages that should be sent out, that look, business is business, politics is politics. There shouldn't actually be a situation where the two are getting mixed up, where people are being favored or targeted because of political affiliations one way or the other. You should try and keep politics out of business, and that would be a good signal for the India story. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think the government could do a good job at saying that. The issue is, how real is that? Because, anyone who's, spent any time in India or done business in India knows that, politics is not that far from business. And when I say business, of course, all business is not the same. As you noted, there are several, businesses that, do quite well, without necessarily, going too deep into some of the political issues. But you can't really get away from the fact that you do need to have, a good relationship with the administration, whether it's at the New Delhi level or at the local levels, and that's an important part of doing business in India. So politics and business are intermingled, and that's true not just for India, but it's true for many parts of the world.
Professor Chakrabarti, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right, let's now move on to a really important story. And it is such an important story that we're going to keep on coming back to it again and again on This World. Because here's a prediction that I'm making for you. If you look back at this entire period of time from, let's say, the year 2040 or 2050, 2023 is in all probability not going to be remembered for any of the things that we by and large discuss. Not Pakistan, not earthquakes, not even the Adani Group. It is probably going to be remembered about the year when AI really entered public discourse in a substantive manner. What happened? How did the big companies in the world start really using AI in a very much more effective manner? They were already doing it, but this was the year when that entire debate and discussion moved from the fringes, moved to a small number of people talking about it, to the center stage. It entered global headlines in a very firm manner. And that's what I said all year long, we're going to go on talking about it. But today, I'm going to talk to you about a really interesting battle in the tech space, and yes, it does involve AI. Bing versus Bard. It's a battle for tech dominance, for ruling the artificial intelligence space. Bing, as most of you know, is Microsoft's search engine. And what about Bard? Bard is Google's AI chatbot. Google announced Bard earlier this week. Google says that Bard is supposed to be a storytelling wizard, hence the name. But on the 8th, the Bard failed to tell the right story. Google was giving a demo for Bard that day, and the chatbot was asked, what new discoveries from the James Webb Space Telescope can I tell my 9-year-old about? Bard gave a number of answers. It also said that the James Webb Space Telescope was used to take the very first picture of an exoplanet, a planet outside the Earth's solar system. Was it? The fact is that that's not true, that the VLT, or the Very Large Telescope of the European Southern Observatory, took the first photo of an exoplanet. They should have asked any of us, we'd have told them. So Bard clearly was wrong. Bard's blunder, though, raised serious questions about its credibility, and rightly so. Was Google selling the world an unreliable chat box? Or is it, at the end of the day, not something which you should be expecting? This is early days. You shouldn't be expecting any of these systems to be perfect. The Google spokesperson said the error, quote, highlights the importance of a rigorous testing process, unquote. So why wasn't rigorous testing done already? To this, the Google spokesperson said the testing process will kick off this week. So why present the world a half-baked case when the stakes are so high? That is the question that I fear we're going to be asked very often. And the answer is going to be that in this case, Google felt threatened. Threatened by whom? By ChatGPT. Now, that chatbot was launched, as you know, by OpenAI in November 2022. And ever since then, people just aren't getting enough of ChatGPT. It's been one of the fastest growing consumer apps or sites in history. ChatGPT's success has clearly jolted Google, and it should, because the obvious question is, what if all of those who come to Google search to look for answers now start migrating to ChatGPT? Google search, by the way, is still at the core of Google's success. And it doesn't help that, for Google, it doesn't help that ChatGPT is backed by Microsoft, a company that just happens to be one of Google's biggest competitors. And Microsoft has invested $10 billion in OpenAI, which is behind ChatGPT. This has spooked Google all the more. The final nail on Google's fear came when Microsoft announced it is now going to be making its search engine Bing smarter by powering it with ChatGPT. But even more serious for Google, what happens if Bing now starts to answer questions asked to it in conversational language and reply in conversational language, give people the exact answers that it wants? How is that going to work? What is going to happen? Is it an existential crisis? So that was it for Google. Within 24 hours, it demoed Bard, and the rest is history. That particular hurry cost Alphabet $100 billion in market value. Its shares slid 9%, which is Alphabet's biggest drop in the last 3 months. Now, how should all of this competition concern you? Let me give you my particular take on this matter. AI, as I have told you in the past, and as I'm going to continue to tell you, AI is going to be one of the most important developments in this era. It is going to change everybody's lives more dramatically than you can imagine it happening. But because it is so powerful, and because we're now getting to AI systems that are way more powerful than anything that we've seen before, we have to be really careful about it. Having guardrails is important. What sort of guardrails? Well, first of all, guardrails about the information that is going out. Remember, ChatGPT right now can't just access the internet and write out stuff. There's a certain data that it's trained on, which is prior to 2021, 2022. Now, what's Google going to be doing with Bard? Is Google going to give it access to the internet? Can it go off and surf the internet by itself and come out and give you answers? Because if it does that, what happens if it is accessing wrong information? There's plenty of fake information everywhere in the world. And if that starts to be thrown up as the authoritative view on a particular subject, that is scary, that is dangerous. That's why expert after expert is saying we need to have guardrails. We need to be careful. Let's not rush into doing things right now which could have a bad impact. And the real danger in this is when you are having existential concerns for companies. If their corporate rivalry is all that matters and their stock prices what matters, sometimes shortcuts will be taken, and those shortcuts could be dangerous. But that's only part of the story. Something that I'm going to talk to you about perhaps next week or week after next is the more existential threat. If you don't have guardrails around AI, then there are more scary things that can happen. You know, the rise of Skynet type things. This is not the time to scare you with all of that, but it is something that we should be thinking about, and I'm going to talk to you a lot more about this in the near future. That's This World this week. I'll see you again next week.